The explosion was perfectly legal, completely justified, and absolutely beautiful. One moment, a gaudy 4,000-square-foot McMansion stood defiantly on my mountain ridge. The next, it was nothing but debris rolling down into the valley where it belonged. I stood there with my coffee, watching the dust settle, and said quietly to myself, "This is what happens when you build on land that isn't yours." 3 hours later, I was served with a lawsuit from the Maple Ridge HOA claiming I had destroyed community property worth $2.5 million. The irony was almost too rich. They built on my land, and now they were suing me for removing their trespass. My name is Marcus Stone, and I own 47 acres of pristine mountain property that my family has held since 1952. This is the story of how an HOA president named Karen Mitchell learned the hard way that property lines actually mean something. I inherited this land from my uncle Theodore, who made me promise to keep it wild and never let developers touch it. The property sits adjacent to Maple Ridge Estates, one of those gated communities where they measure grass height with rulers and fine you for having the wrong shade of beige on your mailbox. I built a small cabin on the far eastern edge of my property, accessible only by a private dirt road that winds through pine trees and granite outcroppings. It was my weekend escape from the city, my place to disconnect and breathe. Karen Mitchell was everything you'd expect from an HOA president with too much time and too little sense. At 62 years old, she ran the Maple Ridge HOA like her personal kingdom, carrying around a tablet loaded with violation photos and a measuring tape she called her compliance tool. She once fined a neighbor $800 for having bird feeders that attracted quote-unquote non-approved wildlife species. The woman actually created a list of acceptable birds. Cardinals were fine, but blue jays were considered too loud and disruptive. The trouble started when I noticed survey stakes appearing on my western ridge, the one with the spectacular valley views. At first, I thought maybe the county was doing some kind of assessment. But then I saw the signs. Maple Ridge Estates Phase 2, luxury mountain living coming soon. They were advertising homes starting at $1.8 million on land that had been in my family for over 70 years. I immediately drove down to the Maple Ridge clubhouse to find out what was happening. Karen was there, naturally, conducting what she called a visual standards workshop, teaching new residents the proper angle for placing decorative rocks in their yards. When I explained that they were surveying my private property, she looked at me with this condescending smile and said in her nasally voice that the expansion had been approved by the board months ago. She actually told me that unused land was wasted land and that I should be grateful they were improving the neighborhood aesthetic. I pulled out my phone and showed her the property lines on the county assessor's website. She waved her hand dismissively and said those old maps were probably outdated. She insisted their surveyor had confirmed the land was part of the original Maple Ridge development tract. When I demanded to see their documentation, she said HOA business was confidential and suggested I schedule an appointment with their legal committee if I had concerns. Then she turned back to her rock placement demonstration like I wasn't even there. 2 weeks later, the construction crews arrived. Not just surveyors anymore, but actual bulldozers and excavators. They carved an access road straight up my ridge, destroyed a grove of 100-year-old pines, and started pouring a foundation. I called the sheriff, but the construction foreman showed me permits signed by the Maple Ridge Development Corporation. Somehow, they had gotten building permits for my land. The deputy said it was a civil matter and I'd need to sort it out in court. My lawyer, James Harrison, was an old friend from college who specialized in property law. When he saw the permits, he laughed out loud. The HOA had filed for permits using their own parcel numbers, not mine. They had literally just drawn new property lines on their submission and hoped nobody would check. It was either incompetence or fraud, and knowing Karen, it was probably both. James filed an immediate cease and desist order, but by then, they had already framed the entire house. The construction continued despite our legal filing. Every day, I watched from my cabin as they added siding, installed windows, and landscaped around this monstrosity on my ridge. It was a grotesque modern design with floor-to-ceiling windows, multiple balconies, and a 3-car garage. They even installed a hot tub on a deck that overlooked my private valley. Karen posted photos on the HOA Facebook page, calling it the crown jewel of Maple Ridge expansion. When I confronted her again, this time with my lawyer present, she had the audacity to suggest I was being selfish. She said in her most patronizing tone that community development benefited everyone and that I should consider donating the land for the greater good. When James pointed out that building on someone else's property was criminal trespass, she replied that possession was 9/10 of the law and walked away. That's when I knew we were dealing with someone who had completely lost touch with reality. The court hearing for our injunction was scheduled 6 weeks out. By then, the house was completely finished. They had even staged it with furniture and were showing it to potential buyers. I watched real estate agents walking couples through my property, pointing out the spectacular views and private setting. One agent actually told buyers it was the most exclusive lot in Maple Ridge, backed by protected wilderness. The protected wilderness was the rest of my land. During this time, I did my own research. I discovered that Karen and 3 other board members had formed an LLC called Mountain Vista Properties. They were planning to build 5 more houses on my land and had already pre-sold 2 of them. They had also applied for conservation tax credits, claiming they were preserving 30 acres of my property as green space for the community. It was a $1 million fraud scheme, and they were doing it right out in the open. James was brilliant in court. He didn't just show our deed and property records. He presented evidence that Karen's LLC had knowingly filed false documents with the county. He showed emails between board members discussing how to quote-unquote acquire the unused parcels through adverse possession. One email from Karen actually said they should build quickly before the hermit on the mountain noticed. The hermit was me, apparently. The judge was not amused. He ruled that the structure was illegal, built without the owner's consent, and must be removed immediately. He gave the HOA 30 days to demolish the house and restore the land to its original condition. He also referred the case to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. Karen stood up in court and shouted that this was a conspiracy against community progress. The judge threatened to hold her in contempt if she said another word. They didn't demolish the house. Instead, Karen filed an appeal, claiming the house was now a historic structure that deserved protection. She actually tried to get it registered as a cultural landmark after it had been standing for less than 4 months. She organized protests at the county courthouse, holding signs that said "Save Our Neighborhood Heritage." She posted daily rants on social media about government overreach and property rights, apparently missing the irony completely. When the 30 days expired, I had full legal authority to remove the structure myself. The court order specifically stated that if the HOA failed to comply, I could demolish the building and bill them for the cost. I hired a demolition company run by a former Army engineer named Tom Bradley. He specialized in what he called precision removal, and he was very good at his job. We scheduled the demolition for a Saturday morning and notified local news stations. This was going to be public. The morning of the demolition was crisp and clear. Perfect visibility for the 20 news cameras that showed up. Tom had placed the charges strategically to ensure the house would collapse into itself, minimizing damage to the surrounding land. Karen arrived just as we were doing the final safety check, screeching up in her white Lexus SUV with personalized plates that read HOA Boss. She jumped out waving a stack of papers, screaming about injunctions and emergency stays. The sheriff's deputy on scene examined her documents and shook his head. They were all nonsense, forms she had apparently downloaded from the internet and filled out incorrectly. She tried to rush past the safety barrier, but the deputy stopped her. She stood there, her face turning purple, shrieking about terrorists and criminals destroying America. Tom gave the countdown over the loudspeaker. 10, 9, 8. Karen was now on her phone, frantically calling someone, probably her lawyer. 7, 6, 5. She was actually crying, mascara running down her cheeks. 4, 3, 2. She fell to her knees like someone in a bad movie. 1. The explosion was controlled and precise. The house folded in on itself like a cardboard box, walls falling inward, roof dropping straight down. Within seconds, the 4,000-square-foot McMansion was reduced to a pile of rubble. The dust cloud rose up and dissipated in the mountain breeze. The news cameras captured every second, including Karen's anguished wail that could be heard even over the rumbling of falling debris. The video went viral within hours. Someone set it to music, creating a remix that got millions of views. The hashtag HOA Karma was trending for 3 days. News outlets picked up the story nationally, running segments about HOA overreach and property rights. Karen became the face of entitled HOA presidents everywhere. Her crying face was turned into a meme that still circulates on social media. But the real consequences came 2 weeks later. The district attorney filed charges against Karen and 3 board members for fraud, criminal trespass, and filing false documents. The FBI got involved when they discovered the tax credit scheme crossed state lines. Karen's real estate license was suspended pending investigation. The LLC was dissolved by court order. The other board members quickly took plea deals, testifying against Karen in exchange for probation. The civil trial was even worse for her. The judge awarded me $3.7 million in damages, including the cost of demolition, restoration, and punitive damages for willful trespass. The HOA's insurance refused to cover it, citing criminal activity. The association had to levy a special assessment of $30,000 per household to pay the judgment. The entire neighborhood turned against Karen overnight. During the board meeting where they voted to remove her as president, she stood at the podium for 20 minutes, ranting about conspiracies and jealous neighbors. She claimed I had hypnotized the judge and that Tom was part of a militant anti-HOA organization. When the vote was called, it was unanimous. Every single board member voted for her removal. She threw the gavel at the wall and stormed out, but not before knocking over the display of community service awards. Her criminal trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of fraud and conspiracy. Her own emails were the most damaging, especially one where she told another board member they needed to grab the land before the owner got smart. Her defense attorney tried to argue she was suffering from stress-related delusions, but the jury didn't buy it. They deliberated for less than 2 hours. Karen Mitchell was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 18 months in federal prison for the tax fraud, 3 years probation, and $50,000 in fines. When the sentence was read, she stood there with her mouth open, unable to speak. For the first time since I'd met her, Karen Mitchell had absolutely nothing to say. She looked around the courtroom like she was waiting for someone to tell her it was all a mistake. When the bailiff approached with handcuffs, she finally broke down, sobbing that she was just trying to improve the community. The judge reminded her that improving the community didn't include stealing other people's land. As they led her away, she turned to look at me one last time, her face a mixture of rage and disbelief.